Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the midst of a total war. I know I probably shouldn't be making this video, but there's always those types of people out there, and so I'm going to. Geometry Dash versus Roblox Obbies. Which platformer is truly harder? Well, I think I might have an answer, and a lot of you are probably not gonna like it. But before I cancel myself, only 5% of you are actually subscribed. So if you end up liking this video, or if you want to see me beat the hardest obby on Roblox, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now, I know that Lognog and perhaps some other YouTubers already made their own video about this, but there's one thing I really want to cover that no one else has quite done just yet, by comparing them directly. Which difficulties of GD may be equivalent to that of etoh, and a logical explanation as to why that may be the case. How will I do this, you may ask? After all, I don't have that much experience in Geometry Dash, but don't you worry my boy, because I've also gathered the opinions and even progress of several people, ranging from true beginners to absolute beasts at what they do. And I already know what you're saying.
Crimzy, you can't really do that because one game is 2D and the other is 3D, so that means there's no way of telling which is harder because skill sets and stuff, and the right side of the triangle is shorter than the hypotenuse.
In Geometry Dash, the difficulty system goes like this: easy, medium, hard, harder, insane, and demon, with demon having its own set of difficulties: easy demon, medium demon, hard demon, insane demon, and extreme demon. For obbies, there's actually two, but the more relevant one is from Eternal Towers of Hell: easy, medium, hard, difficult, challenging, intense, remorseless, and what's known as the soul-crushing difficulties: insane, extreme, terrifying, catastrophic, horrific, unreal, and nil. The very first levels for both start with easy, but does that truly mean that they're just as easy to beat? I'm not quite sure. In GD, you have a singular cube. Now this cube also has several other game modes, but you navigate through levels by using one key only, avoiding spikes and hopping on blocks. In etoh, you have a singular avatar. And that's about it. Except, you navigate obbies by using WASD controls, your mouse to move your camera around, and your spacebar to jump. I'm using PC as an example here because I have zero sympathy for mobile players. Some of the biggest differences are as follows. You can't stop moving in Geometry Dash as opposed to obbies. The average tower takes 10 times longer, 15 to 20 minutes, as opposed to 1 to 3 minutes for a level. Geometry Dash features maximum punishment, with a single mistake ending your entire run, as opposed to towers being more lenient, often giving you a chance to save yourself. Now, what would stereo madness be in etoh terms? Well, this is where I must explain the difference between difficult and tedious. Because while walking for 30 seconds straight may be pretty tedious, it wouldn't really make sense to say it's just as hard as doing a 10-set wraparound. And I think that's the perfect analogy for this. Sure, doing simple jumps for 10 minutes, while potentially making a few mistakes in between, can be really tedious, but that doesn't exactly make it difficult. That, compared to going through more precise inputs, such as the infamous triple spike, leads me to conclude that stereo madness simply takes more skill to beat. My take? Stereo madness is likely anywhere from high easy to maybe perhaps a low medium. But how about a medium level, like Poltergeist or Dryout? They introduce new features like jump pads and orbs, but are they really much of a step up aside from that? Not exactly. The only difference is that there's more obstacles to look out for. This increases the muscle memory load, but not the difficulty of the jumps themselves. I would probably estimate this to take up the medium difficulty in etoh. A hard level like Can't Let Go introduces more load and a bit harder timings. It would likely be equivalent to the bottom half of the hard difficulty. A harder level like Time Machine cranks up the timing aspect, likely on the higher end of the hard difficulty. And an insane level like Clutterfunk, being all around harder, would likely end up somewhere in the difficult range. But what about the hardest main level in Geometry Dash? Doesn't compare to the hardest non-soul-crushing obby in Ring 1? Deadlocked and Tower True Skill is considered by many to be the hardest in their categories. Unless you're a furry with over 600,000 subscribers. Deadlocked features much harder gameplay. Not only are you forced to learn a variety of game modes, you are also forced to learn click patterns in order to get past certain sections. It's not just about timing your clicks, it's about aligning them at the same time. This is certainly a big step up from Clutterfunk, but how does it fare against etoh in terms of progression? You may have noticed that the first few GD difficulties are only taking up several portions of etoh. Does this mean obbies are truly harder, or is there something else going on? For the majority of people, obbies just naturally have a steeper learning curve. For Geometry Dash, you have to deal with more obstacles, but in obbies, you have to deal with nothing but yourself. In order to beat Tower True Skill, you're expected to naturally pick up on things like proper key control, wraparounds, adjusting your angle, micro tapping, and much more. There's a reason why people are doing way bigger jumps in Geometry Dash than in obbies, because obbies just aren't about improving your basics, they're also about learning the hidden rules of thumb in between. If you were to try and jump to Deadlocked from Stereo Madness, sure, you might need to learn all of the game modes, but with enough time and effort, it could certainly be done. In fact, you could probably jump to an extreme demon with this. But as far as I know, you never hear about anyone jumping from an easy tower to Tower True Skill all by themselves, let alone the soul crushing. Because not only is there a wide skill gap, but with the knowledge gap also being present, this feat might just be borderline impossible. And I would say that this learning spike likely happens in between challenging and intense. So while Deadlocked remains a challenge, it unfortunately cannot compare to the hardest non-soul crushing in Ring 1. But if an easy demon like Deadlocked is unable to stand up to an easy soul crushing, which level would? Well, at this stage, you're kinda right. You can't really put an exact estimate. No matter what, there will be people who are naturally better at one game than another. For example, a person might be better at GD because it only requires one key to progress, but someone else might be better at obbies because once you learn the fundamentals, it's much easier to get used to in the long run. But I'm still gonna do it, because by the end of this video, it's all gonna make sense. Now, the easiest soul crushing in etoh is Tower Double Trouble, which sits at the literal baseline. What would be the rough equivalent to around 3 difficulties above that? If we were to take the average progression per Geometry Dash difficulty, which is around half in etoh 1, this would place an Insane Demon around the Remorseless difficulty. But when I asked numerous people what they thought Insane Demon was, I got answers ranging from Remorseless all the way to even Extreme. I'm more inclined to believe it's on the easier side of the spectrum, because challenging the soul crushing is a huge gap in itself, and I'm not sure if my progress from Clubship to Acropolis justifies that leap in difficulty. But what I will say is that Insane Demon to Extreme Demon certainly does, by a lot. I honestly find the gap between an entry Insane Demon to an Extreme Demon even bigger than easy to Insane Demon. The range I got whenever I asked was also noticeably smaller. People's answers only ranged from terrifying to catastrophic. To truly visualize this gap, at least from personal experience, I currently have 56% on Cataclysm with a total of almost 8,000 attempts. Even if we remove my old attempt count, which is roughly 2,500, it would still be around 4,500. Acropolis, however, took me 1,800 attempts. If an entry-level Extreme Demon is already nearing the end of the main difficulty chart, imagine what the hardest levels would be. As we approach towards the last obby difficulties, I'll be going ahead and switching over to multipliers. What does this mean? Basically, it's however many times harder a certain obby or level's difficulty is compared to another, and while it's still bound to subjectivity, it will hopefully give a better idea as to how hard each obby / level is. Now, since Cataclysm is estimated between terrifying and catastrophic for this video, there will be both a low ball and a high ball. I've asked several people what they thought the difference was, and consensus was that a base on Kata was about 1.4 to possibly 3 times harder than a base on Terry. We'll pick a simple multiplier in between those ranges, like 2. That's what we're going to use for our GD high ball. Now, let's assume that terrifying is a 1, and catastrophic is a 2. Meaning catastrophic is twice as hard as terrifying. You may assume that each difficulty is just twice as hard as the last one, but trust me, they're not. And considering how everything is considered catastrophic nowadays, the gap between that and the next difficulty continues to widen. But we'll be using TOGF, as it's almost unanimously agreed that it deserves its difficulty. The only big difference worth mentioning would be something like Tower Champions Road, but with the strats people came up with, along with it being slightly nerfed compared to the verified version, I don't think it would be twice as hard. But something that could definitely be considered twice as hard is Tower Cruel Punishment, the hardest obby in the main game. But if you consider TOAM catastrophic, then it could maybe even be 3 times as hard, since Cruel Punishment is just that tower, but harder in every conceivable way. So that would place Cata/Horrific at a 4 or even an 8. But the difference between Horrific and Unreal is certainly much crazier. The player I'm Very God at Obbies, nice name by the way, took only 3 to 4 hours on a bottom Horrific called Tower of the Homefinder, and a total of 20 hours on Tower of Sudden Death. Why am I comparing these two towers specifically? It's because they have the exact same gameplay style, which makes it the most one-on-one comparison possible. If we were to use these face value, then a bottom Unreal could be anywhere from 5 to 7 times harder than a bottom Horrific, but time isn't everything, because he also failed one of the final jumps with only 12 hours of playtime, and the amount of hours on a given tower is definitely subject to luck, but I believe it's a big difference nonetheless. Going over my personal experience with Tower of Trust Anarchy to Tower of Blind Fate, I would probably estimate that TOBF is about 3 to 4 times harder than TOTA, which would place Unreal anywhere from 12 to upwards of 32 times harder than Terrifying. But we still haven't touched upon the peak of obby difficulty, which will either be TOMH or TOID by the time this video releases. Swift Under 06 has the most Unreal completions out of anyone, with a whopping 8 Unreals to his name, and pretty recently conquered the second hardest tower, Tower of Impending Doom. Now, what does he think the difference is between an entry Unreal to a mid Unreal? Multiple times harder, meaning it could be anywhere from 2 to even 4 times harder than COIV. Not to mention his COIV completion was one of the biggest jumps ever seen in obby history, meaning that his perception of COIV could be severely amplified on top of his previous statement. This gives us a final multiplier of 24 to 128 times harder than Terrifying. That's how hard the hardest obby could be. But what about Geometry Dash? How big is the gap between Cataclysm and the hardest verified level? If you're a GD fan, there's a chance you're drooling in front of the screen, because if you don't know what's about to happen, spoiler alert, it gets completely outrageous. Now, because I have zero say beyond entry Extreme Demon, I'll have to rely on other people's opinions. This is where I stumbled upon the difficulty of Geometry Dash visualized made by Viwi, and while it does state it contains a decent margin of error, it's still a much better start than whatever I could come up with. A level supposedly 2 times harder than Cataclysm is Bloodbath, and while it doesn't feel that much harder when I played it, I can understand the difference. But what about the next big step, Sonic Wave? According to Viwi's video, Sonic Wave is estimated to be 7 times harder than Bloodbath, but is this really true? To put this into perspective, Thinking Space 2 to Eternus is ranked at only 5 times difference, and yet the best runs that anyone's ever gotten were 15% and 71 to 98%. On the contrary, Riot almost verified Sonic Wave, and this was back when Bloodbath was still a top 1 to 3 demon. So yeah, it would more so be like a 2 to 3 times difference if anything, considering factors like Riot's absurd attempt count, as well as the general community taking 1 year to verify, compared to Riot's few months or so on Bloodbath. So a 4 or a 6 so far. But how about Zodiac? It's notoriously above its predecessor Bloodlust, aka Bloodbath on steroids. Well, when you look at the attempt count for both verifications, Sonic Wave took around 15k attempts minus 60 FPS, and 3 years later, Zodiac was verified after 25k attempts. Both were considered one of, if not the best GD players at their respective time, and pretty much anyone who progressed through Sonic Wave at Zodiac got their balls kicked by Zodiac, with statements from Rory also confirming that even the number 2 and number 3 levels at the time are still far easier. It could definitely be at least 3 times harder than Sonic Wave, as even with a year of improving, Technical still had to take a lot longer on its verification. I think a lot of people would assume that something like Tartarus would be another big leap, but the victors for both towers, when they were number 1 and number 2 respectively, claimed that Tartarus is not that much harder, so probably around a 1.5 times difference. However, once we get closer and closer to the hardest level, the gaps become even more frightening. Varium is a player who is mostly known for verifying Hard Machine, which was actually considered around Tartarus difficulty before 2.2. He also went on to verify a level which currently sits on number 33, called Minus Dry. It took him around 43,000 attempts to be Hard Machine, but almost exactly double on Minus Dry, even though explicitly stating himself that it was probably twice as hard as Hard Machine / Tartarus. Considering it's only 5 places below Firework, which is 7 places below Slaughterhouse, and Doggy as well as Denny having a similar statement to Varium's, except that level in question being Slaughterhouse, plus the difficulty perception of Tartarus back then being much higher than it is now, because, well, it was literally just dethroned. Slaughterhouse can be an estimated 1.5 times harder than Minus Dry, and despite Slaughterhouse being unbelievably difficult, there's still an individual who managed to beat it 3 times in a row. That player being W Popoff, who stated it to be harder than even Tidal Wave. But how hard is Tidal Wave exactly? I promise you, you are not ready. But first, we need to talk about Acheron. And while it used to be absurdly difficult, it was nerfed pretty heavily after the 2.2 update. For context, Acheron currently sits 8 spots above Slaughterhouse on the demon list. However, Denny, a player who's been in both the 2.1 and 2.2 version, places the original on number 8, and the 2.2 version actually lower than where it is on the demon list, only 5 places above Slaughterhouse. He estimates that 2.1 Acheron is roughly 2 to 3 times harder than 2.1 Slaughterhouse, with 2.2 Acheron being about 1.5 times harder than 2.2 Slaughterhouse. Now, Tidal Wave was verified on 2.1, but everyone else has been in it on 2.2. Get this, Tidal Wave, according to Denny, who has progress on it, is estimated to be 2 times harder than 2.1 Acheron and up to 4 times harder than 2.2 Acheron. This gives us an absolutely ludicrous multiplier between 162 to 972 times harder than Cataclysm. But it's only number 4. So what about number 1? Well, here's where it gets a little bit weird. Although TS2 is currently the hardest level ever verified, there is a chance that it might not even be that much harder than Tidal Wave, or worse, possibly easier.
Tidal Wave could be harder than both, bro, to be honest.
But I will give the benefit of the doubt and scale the verified version of Amethyst, which is certainly harder than Tidal Wave. A final 1.5 multiplier puts the final count at 243 to 1,458. Nothing short of absolute ludicrousy. Even with the utmost highball of etoh, Geometry Dash comes out on top. But how? Well, once you begin to look a little bit deeper, the answer becomes a bit more clear. After a certain point, the difficulty of obbies begin to diverge a little bit. A lot of the time, the difficulty of the gameplay itself does not get exponentially harder, but can rather stay relatively in the same difficulty range. The true factor would be simply adding more length. Once you reach a certain skill level, it becomes less about improving your actual skill, but more about improving consistency. This creates a false sense of difficulty that in reality relies on external factors such as nerve control, finger lock, enjoyability, and mindset. And even for the skill-based towers, players are able to find strats and alignments to make them easier than they appear. Because of this, Obbies suffer quite a bit in terms of its hardest completions. On the other hand, for Geometry Dash, as you progress, the timings start to get harder, and harder, and harder, and even harder. It just doesn't stop. You are forced to improve. You do have the ability to upgrade to better settings, but apart from that, there's simply no way to cheese through the hardest levels. But why would Geometry Dash have a higher skill ceiling? Consider the fact that Geometry Dash has not only been around for much longer, it's also been consistently way more popular than Obbies. Why wouldn't Geometry Dash have a higher skill ceiling? Is it because Obbies are more complex? Is it because GD players are just bad? Or maybe because some random guy on TikTok said so? Arguing over the absolute pinnacle of impossibility is also completely useless. Because look, I'm gonna create a GD level that's harder than any obby ever built. Done. And now, I'm gonna create an obby that's harder than any GD level ever built. Done. You get my point? It simply doesn't matter. There is no limit. It will never be able to tell the human limit either. It's simply futile. And now, the final answer to the specific question being what is harder, Geometry Dash or Obbies? The truth is, it depends on your interpretation. I know, it's a pretty dumb answer, but it's also a pretty dumb question. In a certain way, both sides are completely right. Obbies are harder to approach due to the vast amount of controls and mechanics you'll have to learn, but Geometry Dash is harder to conquer with the community constantly pushing beyond what was ever thought to be possible. And I don't mean to advocate an end to this debate because let's be honest, people are always going to argue no matter what. But the least I can ask for is to simply appreciate the absolute pinnacle of both these games. The way they both push the skill ceiling is arguably the most impressive out of any achievement category. The only two things they can rely on are better technology and better quality of life. It's simply beautiful to watch. And you know what? So are you for clicking on this video. Thanks for watching. Wait, that sounded kinda weird.